deep in the grey, heaving swells of the North Atlantic. A Liberty ship, one of nearly 3,000 welded emergency hulls, shudders as a pattern of depth charges detonates 100 yards off her starboard beam. The convoy commodore's voice crackles through the bridge speaker, ordering a sharp zigzag, while men below decks feel the thud of distant concussion travel through the steel plating and press against their chests like a physical blow. On the bridge wing, the deck officer squints through salt-crusted binoculars at a thin plume of black smoke on the horizon, holding his breath until the escort destroyer signals a kill with a single green flare curling into the overcast dawn. Every rivet, every inch of cargo space has become a frontline weapon. The survival of the Allied armies in Europe hangs on vessels exactly like this one, a converted Sunderland tramp design that was never meant for war. Behind that single ship stands an invisible colossus of logistics, a global network of railroads, docks, shipyards, warehouses, and administrative offices stretching from the farmlands of Kansas to the bombed-out piers of Cherbourg. Observers at the time faced a pressing question. How did the United States, entering a two-ocean war with a transportation apparatus so fragmented it almost guaranteed paralysis, ever manage to conjure this unbroken, globe-girdling lifeline into existence and sustain it against the worst the German U-boat fleet could throw at it? A proper answer requires stepping back to the first day of September 1939, when German tanks rolled into Poland and the world exploded into a conflict whose sheer geographic scope made the movement of supplies as decisive as any infantry advance. In that moment, the United States Army had no unified transportation command. Indeed, the authority to move troops and material was scattered among a dozen different offices, each jealously guarding its own fragment of turf, and the laws that governed that arrangement had been written in the exhausted aftermath of a different world war 2 decades earlier. After the Armistice of 1918, the Army Reorganization Act of 1920 had placed the bulk of transportation matters, land, water, and rail, under the purview of the Quartermaster General, except for the construction, maintenance, and operation of military railways, which were left in the hands of the Corps of Engineers. For the peacetime army of the 1920s and 1930s, that division of responsibility worked well enough. The Quartermaster General's Transportation Division procured a handful of passenger and cargo vessels, negotiated rail rates, and supervised the modest flow of supplies to outposts in Panama and the Philippines. But within 3 years of Hitler's rise to power in 1933, signs of dangerous inadequacy were already surfacing, and no one in Washington had yet confronted the most basic structural flaw. The Army's transportation management was split between a staff agency in the General Staff and an operating agency under the Quartermaster Corps, and neither could compel the other to coordinate a truly national war effort. The pressure built in increments. In the spring of 1940, German panzer divisions overran France, Britain stood alone, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered a massive rearmament program that instantly overwhelmed the small fleet of aging army transports. By January 1941, the Quartermaster General's Transportation Advisory Group, a panel of industry executives hastily assembled to lend private sector expertise, had begun to warn that the entire system was too fractured to meet the coming demands, and that competing agencies like the Maritime Commission under Rear Admiral Emery S. Land were pulling the nation's shipping in different directions without a coherent plan. A year later, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor ripped away any remaining illusion that time would be on the side of reformers. It was the shock of that two-ocean war, with its simultaneous demands for troops and munitions in both Europe and the Pacific, that finally shattered the old framework. Only 3 months after Pearl Harbor, on the 9th of March 1942, the War Department issued an executive order abolishing the fragmented structure and creating a single entity called the Services of Supply, later renamed the Army Service Forces. At its heart was a new transportation division, and into its leadership was placed a stern, clear-eyed colonel of engineers named Charles P. Gross, who had spent the preceding year fighting the bureaucratic battles inside the General Staff's G4 Supply Division, watching the nation's shipping lines fray under the hammer of German submarines, and growing convinced that nothing less than absolute centralized control over all army movement, from a soldier's hometown to a frontline depot, could prevent logistical disaster. Gross was promoted to brigadier general on the spot, and from the very day he entered his new office, he drove into his staff a single, uncompromising mantra. The final report he would issue 3.5 years later would distill that creed into one sentence. Above all, We have had to be immediately responsive to the needs of the theatre commanders. That sentence captured an entire philosophy, one that insisted that transportation was not a back-office accounting function, but the physical sinew of every military operation, that a delay in delivering ammunition to a forward port was no less damaging than a lost skirmish, and that the officer responsible for the movement of supplies must fight as hard for ships and rail cars as any combat commander fought for ground. But a doctrine, however fiercely held, needed a permanent institutional home, and Gross knew that the transportation division created in March was still a temporary expedient, cobbled together from fragments of the old quartermaster and general staff organizations. On the last day of July 1942, the War Department published General Order No. 38, a single sheet of typed directives bearing the imprimatur of the Secretary of War, which formally established the Transportation Corps as a separate branch of the Army, answerable directly to a Chief of Transportation. The paper itself is unremarkable to the eye. Standard government document printed on the same heavy bond stock as 1,000 other directives, its paragraphs numbered and indented, its language as flat and bureaucratic as a supply requisition. Yet behind those dry lines lay a revolution, for with that stroke of a pen, all the officers and enlisted men carrying out transportation duties across the country were transferred into the new corps. All the port headquarters companies and railhead battalions were redesignated, and a single officer was named to direct the whole. That officer, Charles P. Gross, now shouldered responsibility for the operation of Army ocean-going vessels, the allocation of commercial shipping, the control of port-bound rail traffic, the training of stevedore units for overseas docks, the procurement of harbor craft and marine engines, and the coordination of all military movements, domestic or expeditionary, by rail, highway, and inland waterway. The Corps would soon acquire additional authority over military railways, taking over personnel and equipment from the Corps of Engineers, and even the movement of wounded soldiers by specially designed hospital cars would fall under its supervision. Nearly overnight, the hollow shell of the old pre-war system had been replaced by a unified command that touched every soldier who ever boarded a train, every quartermaster crate that crossed an ocean, and every locomotive that pulled a hospital train across the American plains. The birth of the Transportation Corps was not merely an administrative reshuffling. It was a declaration that in the age of global warfare, the delivery of a bullet was as critical to victory as the pull of a trigger. The Corps would have to fight for ships against sinkings that one officer bluntly called the threat of failure of our war effort, negotiate with civilian agencies like the Warshipping Administration, under Emory S. Land and the Office of Defense Transportation under Joseph B. Eastman, and build a field network of ports, depots, and training camps that would eventually employ more than 400,000 men and women. But the foundation was now laid, and the chief who would guide that immense undertaking had already fixed his compass on the star by which every decision would be measured. The absolute necessity of keeping the pipeline to the theatre commanders open, no matter what enemy submarines, bureaucratic infighting, or domestic crises might do to stop it. In the weeks after the Transportation Corps was born on the last day of July 1942, Brigadier General Charles P. Gross did not pause to savor the bureaucratic victory. He immediately began expanding the authority of his new headquarters, pressing for the transfer of the military railway service from the Corps of Engineers. That fight yielded its first results on the 1st of September, when War Department orders assigned the Transportation Corps responsibility for railway operations and maintenance. The fuller transfer of procurement authority and the formal redesignation of thousands of civilian engineers and specialized railway troops, operating battalions, shop battalions, track maintenance platoons, followed in November, completing the absorption of the military railways into the new corps. The absorption of the railways was profoundly symbolic, a final administrative severing of the fragmented pre-war supply structure. In 1917, the American Expeditionary Forces had suffered 8 chaotic reorganizations of transport control in France, a miserable history that Gross and his superiors were determined never to repeat. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, then commanding in the European theater, had endorsed the principle of integrated transport, and Gross now built his staff to enforce it across every domain: ocean shipping, inland waterways, highways, and heavy rail. The centralization was absolute. For the first time, one agency could plan a shipment from a factory in Ohio to a depot in Australia without a seam. To run this expanding empire, Gross recruited senior executives from commercial steamship lines, major railroads and trucking firms, commissioning them directly into the Corps. Men who had managed fleets of freighters or thousands of miles of track now wore army uniforms and sat in a rapidly filling headquarters along the Potomac. The early organization was experimental, but by the late fall of 1942, it had crystallized into three powerful assistant chiefs: one for operations, one for supply, and one for personnel and training. The operations office fell to Colonel Robert H. Wiley, a regular Army officer who had been with Gross since the earliest days in the G4 Supply Division. Wiley's task was to make the movement schedules work, to synchronize the arrival of tanks at the New York port with the departure of a convoy, to ensure that a trainload of ammunition did not arrive at a dock before there was a ship to swallow it. This required daily, often hourly, coordination with the War Shipping Administration, the Navy, the British Ministry of War Transport, and a dozen other civilian agencies. Gross's doctrine of being immediately responsive to the theater commanders meant that Wiley's staff lived by the teletype machine, their windows blacked out, their coffee cold. Meanwhile, the field establishment was sprouting across the continent with astonishing speed. In December of 1942, Gross created 9 massive transportation zones, each coextensive with a service command and commanded by a seasoned colonel who reported directly to Washington. These zone officers oversaw holding and reconsignment points, freight consolidating stations, port agencies, and railroad repair shops, hundreds of installations designed to catch and control the flow of material before it could congeal into a terminal jam. At the same time, new ports of embarkation were activated at Boston, Hampton Roads, and Los Angeles, while subports were carved out at Mobile, Prince Rupert, and Juneau. The old peacetime bases at New York and San Francisco were no longer quiet depots, but roaring industrial terminals handling tens of thousands of troops and millions of measurement, tons of cargo each month. The scale of the expansion was staggering, and it rested on a foundation of massive military and civilian manpower. By the end of 1944, the ports alone would employ over 170,000 people: longshoremen, crane operators, cargo checkers, marine engineers, and armed guards. But already in 1943, the demand for trained personnel was outstripping supply. The Corps established unit training centers at Indiantown Gap, New Orleans, and Camp Gordon-Johnston, where port battalions, harborcraft companies, and amphibian truck units learned to load ships under simulated blackout, to operate boom cranes in heavy swells, and to drive WKW amphibious trucks through surf. These were not rear echelon support troops. They were the men who would land on hostile beaches and unload ammunition while under sniper fire. The headquarters itself underwent a significant shock in the summer of 1943, a moment of administrative pain that nevertheless sharpened the organization. Brigadier General Theodore H. Dillon, the Deputy Chief of Transportation, who had come over from the old Quartermaster General Staff and held the delicate task of merging two rival bureaucracies, resigned from the Army in June due to severe illness. The pressure of standing up a new corps in the middle of a global war had wrecked his health, and with his departure, Gross abolished the position of deputy chief entirely. In its place, he installed a director system with powerful subordinates overseeing operations, water transportation, materiel and supply, military training, and personnel. The reorganization gave the chief of transportation a flatter, faster chain of command, and it aligned his staff structure more cleanly with that of Army Service Forces headquarters. Lieutenant General Brehon B. Somervell, the commanding general of the ASF, was a hard-charging engineer who had been Gross's classmate at West Point, and who believed that logistics was the decisive weapon of modern war. Somervell demanded that every technical service organize itself to mirror his own staff divisions, so that planning, procurement, and operational control could flow upward without translation or friction. Gross complied, but he also fought fiercely to keep his planning division intact within his own office, resisting a Somervell proposal to absorb it into the ASF headquarters. He argued successfully that transportation planning was inseparable from transportation operations, and that breaking the link would cripple the Corps' responsiveness. While the Washington structure was being hammered into shape, the theater commanders overseas began to feel the weight of the new organization. Gross dispatched experienced transportation officers to every major theater to serve on the staffs of the commanding generals, ensuring that the operational doctrine of central control extended from the factory floor to the forward dump. He instructed his port commanders at New York, New Orleans, and San Francisco to maintain direct radio contact with the theaters for which they were responsible, bypassing intermediate headquarters, to provide instant answers on shipping schedules and cargo priorities. When a theater requisitioned supplies, The port's overseas supply division did not merely forward the request, it edited it, scheduled the flow of rail traffic into the port against specific convoy sailing dates, and then kept the theatre informed of the status of every item. This system was a radical departure from the chaos of the First World War, but it was not without its own internal tensions. The Army Air Forces, which had been granted considerable autonomy under the March 1942 reorganization, continued to operate its own parallel traffic offices in major cities, duplicating the work of the TC Zone transportation officers. Gross argued repeatedly that this was an inefficient use of scarce personnel and that it violated the principle of unified traffic management. But the Deputy Chief of Staff supported the Air Force's desire for independence. Gross accepted the compromise grudgingly, delegating limited routing authority to the Air Forces while retaining final control over port-bound freight and reserving the right to divert shipments in a crisis. The new director system truly settled into place in the late summer of 1943, with Franklin taking full charge of water activities, Wiley coordinating operations, and a new figure, Colonel Luke W. Finlay, stepping into the role of executive officer. Finlay was a West Point engineer and a lawyer in civilian life, a precise analytical mind who could digest the torrent of paperwork that crossed the chief's desk and distill it into crisp options. He and Gross had worked together in earlier assignments, and the mutual trust between them allowed Gross to focus his energy on the highest-level strategic problems: the allocation of scarce shipping, the fight with the Navy over joint logistics, the constant pressure to build more shipyard capacity. The headquarters that had been thrown together in March of 1942 was now a disciplined, specialized instrument of global power. By the end of 1943, the Transportation Corps had grown from a paper organization into a sprawling operational command with over 350,000 military and civilian personnel. Its officers sat on the Joint Military Transportation Committee, the combined Chiefs of Staff shipping boards, and the critical inter-agency committees that divided the world's cargo tonnage among competing armies. The Corps had absorbed the railroads, built new ports, trained tens of thousands of troops, and forged a working relationship with the civilian transportation czars who controlled the domestic front. The foundation was laid, but the greatest test, the massive over-the-beach invasions still to come, had not yet begun. As 1944 opened, the American shipyards were pouring out hulls at a rate that would have seemed a fantasy just 2 years earlier. The Maritime Commission delivered over 19 million deadweight tons of new shipping in 1943. A flood of steel that had finally overtaken the submarine's grim arithmetic of loss. Yet, from his headquarters in Washington, the Chief of Transportation, Major General Charles P. Gross, knew that the number of ships on paper masked a brutal physical reality. The voracious demands of a global two-front war were consuming vessels faster than any statistician could count them. On the first day of the new year, the War Shipping Administration allocated over 14 million deadweight tons of dry cargo and passenger shipping to the Army, nearly half of the entire American-controlled ocean-going fleet. This was an astonishing concentration of maritime power, and it was still not enough. Gross's planning division had calculated that every new division dispatched to Europe and every new island airfield seized in the Pacific generated a permanent, unending demand for cargo capacity, a mathematical chain that tightened around every strategic decision. The pressure to squeeze more lift from the existing fleet fell on Brigadier General John M. Franklin, the pre-war shipping line president, who now directed all water transportation operations for the Corps. Franklin pushed a relentless campaign of cargo pooling, with the British Ministry of War Transport exchanging heavy Lend-Lease steel and ammunition for the bulky, boxed-up trucks and aircraft assemblies that consumed so much of a Liberty ship's precious bale cubic, its interior cargo capacity, measured in cubic feet. In the North Atlantic, a vessel carrying American tanks might return to New York, filled with British Scotch whiskey barrels, each ton of dense commercial freight, allowing the next army convoy to lift just a few more jeeps or crated howitzers. On the Pacific coast, a different kind of contest was unfolding. One fought not against U-boats, but against organizational chaos. On the 12th of February, 1944, the Pacific Coast Joint Committee for Ship Operations was formalized in San Francisco, bringing together the commandant of the 12th Naval District, the commander of the Army Port of Embarkation, and the West Coast representative of the War Shipping Administration. Its purpose was rational: to coordinate the loading and dispatch of the hundreds of cargo vessels pouring out of the Golden Gate toward the Central and Southwest Pacific, to prevent duplicative sailings and idle piers. Gross watched this development from Washington with a deep and well-founded suspicion. He believed that the allocation of shipping was a matter of global strategic consequence, not a local administrative convenience, and that any decentralization of authority would fracture the integrated control he had fought 2 years to construct. When the Navy proposed giving the San Francisco Committee broader power over ship operations, Gross and his commanding general, Lieutenant General Brehon B. Somervell, inserted a clause explicitly stating that Army port commanders would act independently, remaining more responsive to the daily control exercised by Washington over the integrated movements of troops and supplies from origin to destination. The San Francisco Committee would allocate berths and coordinate longshore gangs, but the life-or-death decisions about which ships carried ammunition to MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific, and which carried engineering equipment to Nimitz in the Central Pacific, would still be made by the men who could see the entire war map. That war map was now dominated by a single colossal undertaking: the invasion of northern France. For more than a year, the Transportation Corps had been feeding a steady river of material into the British Isles, building up the stockpiles that would sustain the assault. By the spring of 1944, the Corps staff knew the name of every channel port, every railhead, and every bombed-out quay between Bristol and the Thames estuary. On the 6th of June, the largest amphibious sea lift in human history hurled itself across the English Channel. The Transportation Corps did not command the landing craft or the assault transports. Those were naval responsibilities under the iron control of Admiral Ernest J. King, but the thousands of tons of ammunition, food, medical supplies, replacement artillery tubes, and bridging equipment that followed the initial assault waves, every box, every shell, every jerrycan of gasoline, had been routed, consolidated, marked, manifested, and loaded under the procedures designed by Gross's organization. The Liberty ship, that ungainly 11-knot emergency hull, became the unsung workhorse of the Normandy build-up. Hundreds of them were now fitted with temporary wooden bunks in their 'tween decks, carrying 350 soldiers each on the grinding transatlantic crossing from the United States to the ports of Britain, where the invasion forces marshaled for the final assault across the Channel. The bunks were removable, the conversions crude, but the mathematics were undeniable. A ship originally designed to haul boxed grain could now deliver an entire infantry battalion into the smoking hedgerows of Normandy. The strain on the shipping pool intensified with every week of the Normandy campaign. In July, a new Joint Policy Board was established to strengthen Army-Navy WSA ship repair coordination, and the conversion of Liberty ships into temporary troop transports was accelerated to meet the insatiable demand for lift. Gross, Franklin, and their planners knew that the real crisis was not yet in France. It was gathering silently in the hundreds of cargo vessels now piling up at anchor off the Norman beaches, unable to find an open berth. The bottleneck was physical and brutally simple. The French ports had been shattered by Allied bombing and German demolition. Cherbourg, anticipated as a major discharge point, was a tangle of twisted cranes and sunken block ships, its basins impassable for weeks. The Army and Navy beach parties worked miracles, unloading over the open sand under sporadic artillery fire, but the discharge rate could not keep pace with the avalanche of supplies pouring in from the zone of interior. By the end of August, the situation was no longer a logistical inconvenience. It was a strategic threat. The backlog of idle vessels was mounting steadily. By late October, over 240 cargo vessels were lying idle in European waters, having been fully discharged of only a fraction of their contents. Some ships sat at anchor for weeks, their holds still packed with equipment, serving as floating warehouses while the armies in the field screamed for ammunition and replacements. Gross watched the teletype reports pile up on his desk, each one confirming what he had feared since the previous winter. The theater commanders, in their desperate determination to avoid shortages, had requisitioned far more materiel than their ports could physically receive. The backlog of idle vessels was approaching 10% of the entire American dry cargo fleet, a hemorrhage of tonnage that threatened to starve every other front from Italy to the Philippines. The battle for ships had not been won by building hulls. It had only shifted to a new and equally dangerous phase. The ports were moving over 4 million measurement tons of cargo each month, and the Army-controlled fleet had swollen to a vast, thirsty machine that required nearly 34,000 civilian officers and seamen to operate. In the office of the Chief of Transportation, the Industrial Personnel Division, under Colonel Alexander Corey, tracked the hemorrhage of experienced mariners to the draft, to the better pay of shore industry, and to simple exhaustion. The standby pools at the home ports were supposed to be a reservoir, but by early September, they were all but drained dry. Men were being signed off one vessel and rushed aboard another within hours, without the customary rest. Corey's staff had built an unconventional recruiting machine that reached into union hiring halls, into the Warshipping Administration's training schools, and into the new Marine Officer Cadet School at St. Petersburg, Florida, where young men were put through a brutally compressed course in navigation and diesel mechanics. The cadets graduated into junior deck and engine officer billets on vessels heading straight into the submarine alleys of the Atlantic or the endless, grinding runs of the Pacific. In his urgent plea to the Joint Chiefs, the Warshipping Administrator had laid out a brutal equation. Nearly 400 WSA vessels were frozen inside the theaters for local use, and another 350 ships allocated to the Army and Navy for transoceanic service were lying idle, their cargoes untouched, their crews staring at the shores of France and the Philippines. The President's response was immediate and ice-cold. He declared the situation secondary in importance only to the military operations themselves, ordered the Navy and WSA to speed new ship completions, and directed the Chiefs of Staff to make the most urgent representations possible to every theater commander. The radiogram that flashed from Washington on the 9th of December, over the signature of the Joint Chiefs, was not a request. It was a surgical mandate to halt a hemorrhage that was bleeding the global war effort dry. Theater commanders were ordered to stop using ocean-going ships as floating warehouses and to cease the practice of selective discharge, that slow, surgical unloading of only the most urgently needed items while the rest of a vessel sat idle for weeks. Most significantly, the JCS demanded that a single agency in each theater take absolute control of all shipping, with realistic estimates of port capacity forced upon supply officers who had for months been gambling with impossible delivery schedules. For Major General Charles P. Gross, the Chief of Transportation, who had been watching this backlog accumulate with mounting dread since the Normandy invasion, the radiogram was the vindication of a principle he had fought for since the earliest days of the Corps: centralized, unambiguous control. In the European theater, the machinery of reform was already grinding into motion. Brigadier General John M. Franklin, the Assistant Chief of Transportation for Water Activities, had been dispatched to France in late October with a direct commission to untangle the mess at the ports. Franklin, a former president of a major American steamship line who had been serving as Gross's director of water transportation, walked into a command structure where the theater's supply staff, G4, had been issuing demands for materiel with only nominal coordination with the theater's own Chief of Transportation, Major General Frank S. Ross. The supply officers, desperate to guarantee that the advancing armies would never lack a shell or a ration, had built a cushion of idle tonnage that was now strangling every other theater. Franklin's job was to force them to accept a harsh, disciplined reality. He found that G4 had been calling for ships based on assumptions about port capacity that were months out of date and wildly optimistic, ignoring the twisted wreckage of Cherbourg and the fact that the approaches to Le Havre and Rouen were still dangerously congested with sunken blockships and unexploded ordnance. Franklin told General Eisenhower directly that the backlog of idle vessels was not a comfortable insurance policy. It was a strategic vulnerability, and the Supreme Commander, who had not been kept fully informed of the scale of the crisis, began to demand daily reports on discharge rates and ship positions. In early December, a shipping control committee was finally established inside the communications zone, a tight, three-man board consisting of General Royal B. Lord, the Chief of Staff, Brigadier General James H. Stratton of G4, and Franklin himself, which for the first time forced supply requests to be matched against what the shattered quays could actually receive. A diversion committee was spun up simultaneously, assigning vessels to specific discharge ports the moment they cleared the channel, and refusing to let a single cargo ship wallow at anchor, waiting for a berth that might never open. The opening of Antwerp at the very end of November was the physical salvation of the campaign. Its great basins and lock gates, captured largely intact after a sharp fight by British and Canadian forces, could swallow whole convoys that had been backing up for weeks. But even Antwerp was not a cure-all. The dumps behind the port were shallow, and the trucks and rolling stock needed to clear the docks were competing with the frontline supply columns. So the theater's chief transportation officer, Ross, authorized a stopgap, the temporary storage of material directly in the port area, stacking crates under tarpaulins on every open quay. It was a messy, congested solution, but it kept the cranes swinging and the barges moving, and slowly, grudgingly, the number of vessels awaiting discharge began to drop. Gross flew to Europe briefly in December to see the situation with his own eyes, and before returning to Washington, he detached the chief of his Transit Storage Division, Colonel Leo J. Coughlin, to help Ross design a system of intermediate depots that would act as a buffer between the ports and the forward armies. By the time Franklin returned to Washington in mid-January, the primary mission was accomplished. The theater's shipping program and its capacity to receive cargo had been brought painfully into balance, and the steady hemorrhage of idle tonnage was finally stanched. But even as the crisis receded in Europe, a parallel disaster was unfolding on the opposite side of the globe, in the Southwest Pacific, where General Douglas MacArthur's drive to retake the Philippines had sucked in vessels at a rate that defied all previous planning. The invasion of Leyte had been mounted on a scale that required hundreds of ships, but the ports available were primitive beachheads and small, undeveloped anchorages like Hollandia and Finschhafen, where there were neither enough floating cranes nor enough trucks, nor enough covered storage to handle the torrent of supplies pouring in from the United States. In November, Gross's staff in Washington calculated that 180 vessels were committed to the Leyte operation alone, many of them swinging at anchor for days or weeks while shore parties, under harassment from Japanese suicide planes and occasional surface raiders, struggled to pull off the cargo piece by piece. The chief regulating officer at General MacArthur's headquarters, who controlled the movement of all ships, trains, and aircraft across the theater, had been attempting to prioritize material, but the sheer velocity of the advance and the rapid changes in operational plans had overwhelmed any attempt at orderly scheduling. Selective discharge was rampant. Local commanders, desperate for ammunition or rations, would pull off only the few tons they needed and leave the rest of the ship untouched, a floating depot that drifted from anchorage to anchorage without ever completing its discharge. Gross and his director of operations, Brigadier General Robert H. Wiley, used every tool in their arsenal. They slashed the number of sailings from the United States. They ordered the theater to slash its authorized retentions of trans-Pacific vessels, from well over 100 down to a hard ceiling of 100. And they told MacArthur directly that his operations could be supplied more rapidly if the congestion were reduced and the turnaround of vessels improved. MacArthur, a commander who rarely tolerated interference, responded with personal messages to Somerville, arguing that the campaign was approaching its culminating phase, and any cut in shipping at that moment was tantamount to starving the invasion of Luzon before it could land. But the numbers coming off the teletypes in Washington were irrefutable. Nearly 500 ocean-going vessels, combining the Trans-Pacific Fleet with the ships operating inside the theater, were tied up in the Southwest Pacific in January, and the global shortage was so acute that President Roosevelt himself had demanded action from the chiefs of staff. The War Department held firm. The cutbacks remained in force, and slowly, as the beachheads matured and the engineers laid down pier matting and built new access roads, the discharge rates crept upward and the number of idle vessels began its grudging, gradual descent. Wiley flew to Manila in the spring to confer with MacArthur's staff, and the general, who was then preparing the final assaults on the Japanese home islands, acknowledged that the logistical tangle had been severe, but insisted that the military dividends of the accelerated timetable had justified the confusion. It was a judgment that historians would debate for decades. But while the shipping crisis was the most visible and dramatic struggle of the winter of 1945, a second, quieter catastrophe was brewing inside the continental United States, one that threatened to throttle the entire logistical machine at its source. The American railroads, which still carried over 90% of all military freight and nearly every soldier moving to a port of embarkation, were approaching a point of physical collapse, hammered by a perfect storm of weather, manpower drain, and equipment starvation that had been building since the earliest months of the war. The winter of 1944-45 was one of the most brutal in decades, with heavy snow and ice paralyzing the vital northeastern rail network. But the fundamental problem was structural. The carriers had entered the conflict with a fleet of locomotives and freight cars that was already aged, and the War Production Board, prioritizing landing craft, tanks, and aviation engines, had for years starved the railroads of the steel and fabrication capacity needed to replace their worn-out rolling stock. The Office of Defense Transportation, first under Joseph B. Eastman, and then, after Eastman's death, under Commissioner J. Monroe Johnson, had repeatedly pleaded for higher priority ratings for railroad equipment, but the armed services had remained firm that military needs were paramount, and the result, by March, was a system operating on its last margin. Freight cars that in peacetime would have been scrapped as unrepairable were being patched and sent back out onto the main lines. And the number of cars reporting as surplus in any region had dwindled to virtually zero, while the shortages grew sharper every week. It was, as the president of the Association of American Railroads had warned 2 years earlier, a situation scraping the bottom of the barrel. Gross, who had spent his entire command fighting for centralized control and who understood that a stalled rail network was as lethal to his mission as a sunken convoy, authorized an extraordinary step. The Transportation Corps arranged for 300 soldiers with railroad experience to be furloughed from their units so they could return to the civilian carriers and help break the worst of the congestion around Buffalo, where snow had buried entire marshalling yards. The number was soon raised to 600, and the furloughs were extended to other districts in upstate New York. It was a recognition, grudging but inescapable, that the Army could not fight a global war without a functioning domestic railway system, and that the railroaders in uniform were more valuable moving freight cars through a frozen yard than carrying a rifle in a rear area depot. The winter crisis slowly eased as the weather broke, and as the War Production Board, responding to the final desperate appeals of the ODT, finally raised the priority ratings for critical railroad equipment. But the scars of the near collapse would remain embedded in the institutional memory of the Corps for years. Then, on the 15th of August 1945, after the atomic bombings, after the Soviet declaration of war, after the annihilation of the Imperial Navy in the Philippine Sea and the capture of Okinawa, the Japanese government surrendered unconditionally, and the character of the Transportation Corps' mission reversed in a matter of hours. The pipelines that had been pumping men and materiel into the Pacific for the planned invasion of Kyushu were instantly repurposed. Instead of delivering fresh combat divisions, the ships would now be used to bring home the exhausted veterans of Europe and the Pacific, a repatriation task that in scale and complexity rivaled the original build-up. Gross's staff, which had been quietly planning for this possibility since the spring of 1944, activated demobilization schedules that shifted the flow of tonnage from ports like New York and San Francisco into a reverse gear, preparing for the largest mass movement of human beings across the surface of the planet in the shortest time yet attempted. Liberty ships that had been carrying ammunition and gasoline into the forward areas were hastily refitted with additional berths. Hospital ships that had been evacuating wounded were retasked for the longer voyage home, and the railroads, still smarting from the winter collapse, were warned to prepare for an incoming tide of soldiers that would make the Normandy build-up look like a skirmish. On the last day of November, Major General Charles P. Gross sat at his desk in the headquarters of the Transportation Corps and signed his final wartime report, a document that distilled the experience of the largest transportation organization ever assembled into a set of lessons and principles that he hoped would endure. The pages did not celebrate battles won or ports captured. Instead, they returned, again and again, to the central article of Gross's faith, the absolute necessity of centralized control, of a single agency with unbroken authority from the factory floor and the training camp all the way to the discharge port in a foreign theater. He wrote that the Corps' success had been built on being immediately responsive to the needs of the theater commanders, a phrase that had been his personal creed since the first weeks of the war, and he concluded, with the hard-won confidence of a man who had fought a bureaucratic war on 3 continents, that the dispersion of transportation responsibility was, and always would be, a source of fatal weakness. The Corps he had built from a paper charter in the desperate summer of 1942 had grown to command over 400,000 men and women, to operate a fleet of nearly 2,000 ocean-going vessels and thousands of smaller craft, and to move finally more than 7 million soldiers across the seas and back again, a scale of human displacement never before accomplished, and with the arrival of the atomic era, never to be needed in quite the same way again. Gross, the engineer from the Nicaraguan Canal Survey who had studied logistics in the trenches of the First World War and spent the interwar decades in quiet, unglamorous billets, had become the man who moved the might of the American industrial machine across the oceans and delivered it to the battlefields that ended the greatest war in human history. After the war, Major General Charles P. Gross retired from the Army, his name etched into the institutional memory of the Transportation Corps as its founding architect. The Corps itself, though reduced in size, was recommended for permanent status, a recognition that the lessons of global conflict could not be unlearned. Lieutenant General Brehon B. Somervell, Gross's classmate and the relentless commander of the Army Service Forces, who had pushed for maximum production and backed the Chief of Transportation in his fights for priority, returned to civilian life. His wartime organization dissolved, but his doctrine of integrated logistics permanently shaping the future structure of the Department of Defense. John M. Franklin, the steamship executive who had become Gross's director of water transportation and who had walked into the chaos of the European theater to drag the port crisis under control, resumed his pre-war career. His troubleshooting mission to France and Belgium remained a case study in how a single, technically competent officer, backed by unflinching authority, could reverse a disaster that was threatening to unhinge the entire Allied war plan. And Frank S. Ross, the Major General who had served as Gross's executive in the old transportation branch of G4 before being dispatched to the European theater, continued to serve as the theater's chief of transportation through the occupation and into the early days of the post-war reorganization. His experience with the port congestion crisis, making him a fierce advocate for the kind of centralized theater transportation command that Gross had envisioned from the beginning. The story of the Transportation Corps is not a story of beaches stormed or ribbons won. It is the story of a quiet, invisible, and absolutely indispensable triumph of organization over chaos, of the conviction held by a handful of officers that the side which manages its logistics best will, in the end, prevail.